A gifted pianist who perceives sound as color loses his synesthetic vision after a stage accident. Struggling to play without his inner light, he confronts fame, memory, and identity, learning that even without color, music can still be a language of survival.
There are small rituals that precede every performance: the check of the bench's height, the exact manner of smoothing a score, so that the hairline crease falls where the eye expects it. The way I count under my breath, once, twice, long and then short, the internal metronome that precedes the first touch. That night the ritual was as precise as the cut of a surgeon's glove. Vienna had the particular hush of broad, well-practiced custom. The hall, older than either of us, held us in the patient way of a house that has learned what visiting bodies will do. The program was as I had chosen it for reasons no manager could catalogue: an opening sonata that maps a morning, a central nocturne that lingers like a tide, and a chop and etude that, in my mind, always bent the air into apricot. The lights let the stage be seen as an instrument. They were a thin architecture, bright, meticulous, and indifferent design to make faces readable from the stalls. Under them the piano became a locus, black lacquer catching the white spill of a beam, the curve of the lid a dark arch against the stage. To an audience, we are monument and motion. To me we were an atlas. I could say, without rhetorical flourish, that sound had always been a kind of cartography. Specific pitches had colors and textures that I could walk along. And each piece I prepared established routes I could travel without getting lost. C-sharp blood indigo, Aloha sat in a deep, marine blue at the base of my inner field, and Chopin, with the audacity of his ornamentation, arsed apricot across the middle register in a way that, to me, justified certain rubatos. It was private as the way a man remembers his father's hand, and it was necessary. There was a precision to this interior life that concert-goers seldom appreciate. They see hands and hear notes. They do not see what I saw: harmonies rendered as ribbons of color, rhythmic accents as tiny sparks along the edge of my vision, cadences that closed like the lowering of a curtain of blue. This kind of perception is not theatrical. It is not show. It is the map I consulted to play with a confidence that had nothing to do with vanity. Audiences assumed I trusted in memory and technique. I did. But I had another compass, one that felt less like an aid and more like an organic appendage. When the first movement began, I recall the small, animal settling of my shoulders as the sound opened in my head. The audience's breath was a soft fabric. From the seventh bar, I had the color field, an undercurrent of indigo beneath the right-hand filigree, something like a greenish-yellow in the accompanimental bass. It was ordinary, the way dawn is ordinary when it arrives for the 400th time. The conductor, whose gestures were spare but entirely intelligible, nodded once and then let the current carry us. It was during the second piece, in a passage where the orchestra receded and the piano was left to articulate a delicate figure, that an element of stagecraft failed in a manner so absurdly precise that the authority of the world briefly faltered. A light that I had not perceived as being precarious, no hint of danger, no loose cable to the eye came free of its fixture. It fell with a metallic staccato that seemed, in its particularity, more obscene than any generalized crash. The sound itself was deceptively exact, a short, bright report, not thunderous, but sharp enough to cleave the air and make 1,000 necks turn. I should qualify my memory. Events in a hall are folded and stitched by perception. One person's chronology is another's jumble. To my left the cello section inhaled and did not exhale. To my right the violin's bows paused as if fingers had been pulled back from a flame. The conductor's baton stopped. A ripple of noise shuffling, an exclamation, a child's cry moved through the stalls like weather. The house light, which until then had been faithful to tradition and to the work of presenting us as objects of study, seemed to flare with the suddenness of a camera's bulb. In that motion there was a kind of arithmetic, a cause and then an effect. The stage manager was moving even as the lamp hit the floor. Hands learned to pass a crisis into choreography. What I remember most precisely is not the accidental clang nor the choreography that followed, but the instant after, which in my memory stretches to ridiculous length. The notes that followed my fingers remained, clinically, the right notes. The A sounded like an A, the E like an E. They were correct in the fashion of a clock. But the private light that used to accompany them, the indigo that pooled on the C-sharp, the translucent salmon that outlined a held B, was simply not there. It was like opening a manual only to find half its pages blank. There had been no warning. One moment the field of color was available to me, the next moment it read as an absence so sharp it might have been edged with pain. I suppose the simplest report one might give would be that the accident broke something in me. That, however, is both too blunt and too confessional. The truth is more particular. The sensory network I had considered as reliable as the muscles of my hands ceased to bind certain inputs together. Sound remained. It had not been extinguished. The venue's acoustic remained intact. Applause and muffled cries affirmed that the ears of others were functionally unimpaired. But my ear no longer reached across to the color. The map had been taken away while the territory remained. People around me acted as people do when confronted by something that might be a hazard. The conductor raised his arms with the rusty instinct of someone attempting to reassert order. A brief phrase was struck to fill the void of decision. Someone, perhaps the stage manager, perhaps the house lights, called for calm. Footsteps were quick and then hesitant. A nurse in the audience, who would later be described in a newspaper as quick and composed, moved through the front rows. The camera is inevitable in this city, whose appetite for narrative is as reliable as its weather, began to light at the edges of the stage with small, cold flashes. Those flashes did not reflect my loss. They reflected a different economy, the public's demand for immediacy, for an image that might be captioned and filed. In the moments that followed, I felt like an object under examination. Hands reached for me, gentle, professional hands, and I was guided off the bench with the trained efficiency to which a stage served as a kind of whispered etiquette. There were murmured questions about whether I could continue. There were the small, practical questions artists know how to answer, a return at once possible, a demand for composure. But my answer to such practicality was private and refused to be translated. The absence of the color field meant that nothing in the old way of playing would have the same logic. A nurse, her badge said we in Krankenpflege, placed a reassuring cloth at my neck. Someone offered a sip of water. I remember the taste of mineral, the way it registered like a marker that would later be read by an editor who had not been in the room. Hydration. Marta's voice came 10 minutes later, via the phone in the wing, crisp, businesslike, asking for facts and deadlines. She used words like contingency plan and press statement. My responses were short. I said I was fine because there was a grammar for public-facing replies. I did not say that a private organ of perception had been switched off. It would be a mistake to treat the instant of loss as if it were merely neurological. There are social realities that follow. Papers file copy, lawyers assemble, critics speculate, and these external currents enforced a kind of narrative about what had occurred. In the days that followed, the newspapers would not only recount the event, but invent an economy of cause and blame. I knew this in the way any professional knows the textures of an industry. They would want explanation. They would want drama, suspension, or redemption. None of these categories, though, are adequate when the thing that has been withdrawn is as intimate and as useless to commerce as a color in your mind. When I finally left the hall later, much of the hall's business was handled while I sat in the wings. I felt the weight of eyes in a way I had not experienced for years. There is an expectation surrounding a musician that we will transform threat into beauty, that the moment of risk will be converted into performance. This expectation is not malevolent, it is historical, but the structure of that expectation did not notice my private absence. There was for them the necessity of narrative. For me, the necessity was different and smaller, to understand whether the map could be recovered. I went home to a small flat where the panes are old, and the light falls in narrow stripes across a piano my mother had once approved in a way that mattered to me. The room smelled faintly of lemon soap, and the tea I had left in a cup by the sink now went flat under a film. I made an effort to be rational. I catalogued the steps I would take, the calls I would return, the medical appointments I would make. The city outside seemed indifferent, as if nothing of consequence had occurred beyond the small traffic of its cafes and trams. The apartment's walls hold memories the way paper holds ink, faint, layered. I tried, that night, to play. That sentence will read to many as an inevitable measure of pride. It was not so much pride as necessity. Musicians are trained to respond to the instrument. My fingers found patterns, the pedaling was correct, the phrasing logical as notation. The sounds were true. But the private color map that used to let me anticipate the emotional weight of a phrase, the indigo that told me when to soften, the little apricot flare that permitted me to yield, was not available. The effect was akin to reading a familiar text in a language you understand as syntax, but without the vocabulary that gives it life. I could have, at that moment, relied on study and muscle alone. Instead, I found myself hesitant, as if the board under my feet were missing its customary grain. That kind of absence is not only clinical, it takes on moral shading in the company of memory. I thought, as I sat, of the early lessons when my mother first noticed the way I saw sound. She had never made of it an industry. It was a domestic marvel, spoken of softly. I thought of the conservatory in my 20s, and the way colleagues had joked and envied in the same breath. I thought as well of small, private defeats, the letter from a father who could not understand my choice, the sibling whose absence at a funeral once made me play with a different kind of concentration. These recollections have a way of magnifying the present. Loss, when it is private, becomes proof against vanity. If one does not have the part of oneself that felt unique, what remains? I had thought I might be able to answer that question in the coming weeks. That thought, which is both hope and cruelty, keeps a man awake. At 2 a.m. I found my phone had recorded a dozen messages from Marta, each more managerial than the last. In the background of her final one was someone making arrangements, lawyers, perhaps, and a voice that suggested the machinery of repair rather than consolation. She asked me to consider an interim statement for the press. How do you compose a statement when you cannot yet name the wound? I set the phone down and tried to recall the sensation of a bee in full color. The attempt felt like groping in the dark. It was a private test and a personal humiliation. I slept fitfully and awoke to a day that already had the shape of inquiry. I had not yet been asked to give a formal account, but I knew the town would soon convene its forms, statements, investigators, the polite but raking interviews. I knew I must answer, eventually, and I knew as well that the answer I could give would be partial. The moment that the lamp fell would be spoken of in terms that made it less strange an accident. A freak occurrence, and yet the untroubling precision with which my inner palate had been erased would resist tidy explanation. If there is a point to begin, then it is here. The map that had been my private provision was gone in an instant that could be described without melodrama as both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary because the mechanics of the hall had failed, and extraordinary because the failure intersected with an interior arrangement, producing a loss that everyone would see only as a component of a larger story. For me, however, it had the density of intimate bereavement. I did not yet know whether recovery would be possible, whether the cord could be rewired, whether the colors might thicken back into being. That is the question I carried with me as I closed the piano's fallboard and let the keys darken under my palms. The city outside went on. Inside me a different kind of silence took root, one made not of absence of sound, but of the absence of a private light. There is a small, humiliating dignity in being required to make the first public face of a wound. I learnt that night the economy of restraint. The cameras that hovered later would seek one narrative: collapse, culpability, or miracle. None of these narratives were mine yet. I could only hold the fact of the vanished color like a ledger entry, precise in its wording, heavy in its implication, and dangerously open to interpretation. I would have to wait, of course. The city has a way of insisting on immediacy, yet some losses are not susceptible to headline cures. Art is not in there to be rescued by print. It is, instead, a patient architecture of practice. The lamp had fallen, the light had gone out. I closed the book and sat in the dark, counting, as I had always done, in small, exact measures, and listened to the purely acoustic world I had always also known. Outside, the night swallowed the hall. Within me, the map lay blank. I woke the morning after the press calls, and the blank camera flashes with hands that belonged to someone I had known by reputation rather than by touch. They were the same hands in shape and in habit, narrow knuckles, long nail beds that I kept short. The pilgrimage scar along the left thumb from a conservatory exercise decades old, but their meaning had altered. For a lifetime I had moved them beneath a sense that sound was always double, a tone and its wash. I could have convinced myself, had I been a different sort of person, that this alteration was simply a mood or a new ending to an old career. Instead, I woke to find the world thinner. Color had receded from sound as if a comb had been run through a saturated cloth and taken the dye with it. I live now in a flat small enough that the piano fills it. It is an upright with a satin finish whose varnish was gentled by years of polish and a few thoughtless knocks from touring baggage trolleys. The room retains the faint odor of rosin and lemon oil I use for the keys. After the concert, the door lock still sticks slightly, a flaw I had arranged to ignore in the name of efficiency. That morning the stickiness struck me for its triviality. I had been carried by practices of small evidence for a long time, the folded towel beneath one wrist, the particular angle at which I placed the metronome, the way I counted silently into a phrase. Those small acts had given my days a logic when the public logic was crude applause, reviews, contracts. Without the color of sound, the small acts assumed a disproportionate weight. I made tea the way one makes it when ritual is the only competent thing one can manage. I heated water until it trembled with the first round of bubbles, and listened to the radiator click as the building woke. The tea I prefer is a cheap one by taste but honest in its infusion. I steeped it long enough to coax something mild from the leaves and sat with the cup clutched between both hands. The flat was quiet in a manner that did not comfort. It merely permitted the room to register distance. On the piano the last program remained open, a score with annotations in a hand that had once known the exact angle of attack required to make a chord bloom into its color. I sat, lifting the cup, and let the silence take its shape. I made the first attempt to play like a man testing whether his limbs had forgotten to obey him. I placed myself in the old position, feet aligned with the pedals as if they were compass points, hands hovering a hair's breadth above the keys. The counting was the same, a private murmuring, the intake of breath, the beginning. I know, perhaps too well, that such mechanics live by habit rather than by sentiment. In the first bar my fingers found the notation. They did not fumble the fingering. The phrasing arrived with the same old muscles. The sound was right. The piano informed me it would still render precise intervals. The mechanics were obedient. But where there used to be a small, private apparition, a smear of bluish night beneath a low, the impatient red of a staccato in the right hand, there was nothing beyond the sound itself. There was accuracy, and there was absence. I stopped, and the echo died into the curtains. It was worse than incompetence. A phrase that once communicated to me as both tone and image now existed in single registration. If music is a language, mine had become a grammar without its habitual vocabulary. When one reads a foreign text, the letters are meaningful even if the nuance is missing. But this was as if the vowels had been removed. I finished the piece because habit dictated completion, because a man who has lived by certain small rituals finds it intolerable to leave them half enacted. After I closed the fallboard I sat with my hands in my lap like a man who had given and received nothing. Voicemails accumulated as if the world typed its courtesy into thin boxes. There were messages of condolence and messages of speculation. Some attempted solace, others circled the accident with cool curiosity. My phone made the muffled sound of the city leaking into my solitude, a siren, a bus braking, a distant argument. I listened to one message recorded in a professional voice. Dear Mr. Caller, we are thinking of you in this difficult hour. Please accept the orchestra's deepest sympathies. The words were meant to be a bridge. They did not reach me. I did not answer. I told myself that this refusal was a temporary, rational choice, that I would respond when I could locate the voice that used to translate the world for me. In truth, I was alarmed by the idea of conversations that expected a return to the former projection of self. I feared that my voice, should I speak, would be an ersatz copy of the one journalists wanted. There was also, beneath those motives, a more blunt discretion, the shame that attends the loss of capacity. It is a private shame, not yet public. I am tidy with it as with a wound. To show it before it scabbed felt foolish. A knock at midday was therefore out of place. Marta's timing is precise. She arrives at the edges of crisis to administer inventory. She has a practical manner that can be read as cold if one expects the melodramas of comfort. I opened the door to find her standing outside with a small leather folder and that exacted expression known well from years in the business. She did not enter at once. She waited as if taking measure of the building's mood. You look as if you haven't slept, she said without preface. Not in a way that counts, I said. She nodded as if that answered something more complicated than a simple sleep deficit. We sat at the small table. She ordered tea with a practicality that implied she did not want to linger in sentiment. Marta has an economy of small kindnesses. She brings fruit because it is nutrition, not because it is consoling. Listen, she said after a moment. I've spoken to a few people. There are offers and there are liabilities. You know how I think about those two things. We have to decide which of them we will entertain. I tried not to show the trimmer in my hands when I folded the napkin. What do you mean by offers, Marta? A stage, interviews, damage control, all of the above. There is the usual appetite for a comeback narrative. You know how these things run, a staged return, a piece written about the miraculous restoration. It will be lucrative, and it will be intrusive. You'll be subject to a narrative you do not control. I had the ready, brittle, professional anger of the person whose vocation has made them used to being commodified. It's not just a narrative, I said. There was an event. People were hurt. Marta's face softened in a way she rarely allows. Precisely, there was an event. There is also a market that wants an ending, and a press that will shape one whether you consent or not. We can concede them a version of closure and deprive the tabloids their invention, or we can refuse and see what they invent anyway. I thought of what refusal looked like, endless speculation, press vans outside this block, a building that had been my refuge turned into a stage set. The idea made me feel naked. And if I say nothing, I asked, then they will say anything. She brought the leather folder across the table and opened it as if doing so would produce a lie in more informative terms. Inside were press clippings, a few suggested statements, and a phone number with the word neurologist written in plain blue ink. Neurologist. The word made me taste antiseptic. In the conservatory we had a joke about the medicalization of eccentricities. I thought that's what long interviews and the odd specialist would do next season. You are saying I should see one. I'm saying you should let the professionals rule out what can be ruled out, and then we will decide on narrative after that. You do not have to perform tomorrow, but you must know what you are dealing with. A clinical report will limit rumor. I sat with the tepid cup between my palms. There are thresholds in these conversations. I could refuse. I could decline Marta's offer like a man who, having been burned, would rather live in the dark than show his singeing. Or I could accept that some small bureaucracy might clear the air. The idea of containment appealed to me not because I trusted bureaucracy, but because it promised the vocabulary of normality, diagnosis, prognosis. A set of improbable verbs like recover and adapt. Those words offer purchase. It is a modest hope. If I go, I said slowly, it should be only to know, not to satisfy the press. Marta's mouth tightened. I could read the calculation. I'll make a call then, discretion, and Matthias no staged comeback. Not yet we test, we listen, we prepare. If a return is possible it will be honest. Honest, I repeated because the word had a soft resonance that I had not used in public for a long time. She folded the folder and rose. "I'll be in touch about dates. Do not make any statements. If someone calls, refer them to me." She hesitated at the door. "And answer your phone." There is a tone in that sentence that implies a trust I had not expected. It was not an order but a plea for participation. I promised because saying no was heavier than saying yes. When she left, I stood at the window for a long time, watching the city practice its indifferent miracles of going on. Outside, a tram crawled by, making the usual scrape of iron on rail. The afternoon wore itself down into a cooler light. In the empty corner of the room, a record player I had not used since the incident sat like an ornament. I thought of the old way I listened when I allowed music to lay over the day, the radio before bed, the small, private curations that had once felt like a secret life. Now the radio sounded the same as any appliance, a register of frequency rather than an offered sign. Later that night I tried to play again. If the first attempt was a way to test muscle memory, the second was a test of will. I placed a new score on the stand, a small sonata of someone I admired but had not needed to mine for color before a neutral enough piece, perhaps, to show whether the mapping returned in anything like a predictable way. I counted the old silent method, 3 small and drawn breaths and then the first downbeat. My hands obeyed, the music sounded. People have a tendency to conflate volume with feeling. My playing remained perfectly textured in all its articulations, and yet the sound went no further than the acoustic. The piece was competent, correct, but it was also unadorned by the mental chroma I had always thought necessary to my understanding of it. I became aware with a clarity that was its own cruelty that a great part of my practice had always been interpretive in the way one overlays a tune with private color. When the color vanished, the interpretive scaffolding collapsed. It was not simply that I could not see a blue where a low C should be. Rather, having lost that auto-instruction, I had to translate music back into a language of shape and consequence rather than hue. In itself, this is not impossible, of course. Many musicians find plenty of meaning in touch and in form, but for a man whose inner navigation had been predicated on a transmodal mapping, the available roads felt suddenly unsafe. The failure tightened the day into the sensation of a hinge that had rusted and would not move. I put my hands beneath the fallboard and rubbed them together. The skin was dry. The practice of making tea and counting would have to expand into another architecture of work. I sat for some time and made lists. Writing lists has always steadied me. In the early years before a concert, the lists are devices of control, repertoire, fingering notes, travel headaches, boots for the train platform. Now my lists were inventories of absence. Under today I wrote, 1 answer Marta, 2 practice 30 min, 3 listen to 1 recording. Under urgent I wrote only 1 appointment with neurologist pending. The day dissolved into a sequence of small chores. I washed a mug and hung the towel with the precision of a person arranging evidence. At some point a television from a downstairs neighbor carried a recording of an old concert not mine, and applause filtered up through the floorboards like applause for a man no longer in the habit of receiving it. It sounded both familiar and foreign. I realized that even my relationship to applause had changed. Once it relieved me of the need to account for a briefer moment. Now it felt like an accusation, loud and careless. Night came with the cold patience of an investigator. I lay awake and replayed the day's failed phrases. Memory, in the dark, is not a continuous reel but a series of sharp frames, a girl's hand in a market once reaching for paint. The conservatory's damp corridors, where an instructor once tapped the metronome with a disapproving finger. My mother's small flat where she had once noticed my anomalous cross-sensory remarks and laughed with a mixture of puzzlement and pleasure. These were not consolations. They were facts arranged in little file drawers. The loss of color had not only taken one way of encountering music. It had called into question every past instance in which that faculty had acted as an ally. The phone vibrated on the bedside table as if to insist the life beyond me continued. I hesitated, then reached and answered. It was Marta. I booked the neurologist, she said. Her voice had the crispness of someone closing a file. You will not like the waiting room.